a bleeding nation, crippled by a decade of occupation. 10 years after the US-led invasion of Iraq, what are the lessons from the war that shook the world?
I've been in those boots. Those are uncomfortable boots.
We track the changing calculus in the war on terror and its sequels.
We don't need to send tens of thousands of our sons and daughters abroad or occupy other nations.
As Africa becomes the new front line, have the Europeans learned from America's mistakes?
You ask what we will do to terrorists if we find them. Destroy them.
Did the Mali conflict pose a global threat? And what future for the war on terror? I am Marwan Bishara, and this is Empire. 18 months after the September 11 attacks on New York and Washington, the wrath of the U.S. global war on terror was visited upon the people of Iraq. Here in America, some saw the invasion and occupation of the country that had nothing to do with al-Qaeda as a stupid and dangerous departure from the logic of the war on terror. Many others cheered the illegal war, including the countless pundits that continue to lecture us about the rights and wrongs of U.S. policies in the Middle East. The pretext of the war was security and freedom, but the bombastic and openly pronounced objective was no less than the illusion of remaking the greater Middle East region. And for the last 10 years, as Iraq bled and the war on terror expanded and mutated to various new fronts, Washington and its European allies have been preoccupied by how they can win and how and who they will fight next. To help us answer the more fundamental questions regarding the merits, objectives, cost, and morality of these wars, we are joined by John Nagel, a professor at the U.S. Naval Academy and retired lieutenant colonel who co-authored the U.S. Army and Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Field Manual. Jean-Marie Guéhenno, director of the Center of International Conflict Resolution at Columbia University, a former French diplomat who served as United Nations Under-Secretary General for Peacekeeping Operations. And Barbara Boudin, a professor at Princeton University, a former U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Yemen, and who served with the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance in Iraq. And last but not least, Christopher Hedges, a senior fellow at the Nation Institute, former New York Times Middle East bureau chief, and author of several books, including his most recent, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. But first, let's try and refresh our minds about Washington's arithmetic of war in Iraq and beyond.
Every U.S. administration makes its own calculation about the proper exercise of power. President Clinton's top diplomat asserted that hundreds of thousands of civilian lives were acceptable as collateral damage of sanctions on Iraq.
We think the price is worth it.
Bush and Cheney's notorious 1% doctrine argued that even a 1% risk justified preemptive invasions.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
The Obama administration has tried to distance itself from the past and develop a new calculus of war.
Any future defense secretary who advises the president to again send a big American land army into Asia or into the Middle East or Africa should have his head examined.
10 years after Operation Iraqi Freedom started with shock and awe, we ask, how has this war changed Iraq? How has it changed America? It's hard, but helpful on this grim anniversary to think back to the justifications for war. There was the nuclear threat.
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
The al-Qaeda connection.
Iraq is a part of the war on terrorism.
Regime change.
I think the people of Iraq will welcome all of this and understand that we have come in peace, not as conquerors, but as liberators.
The threat of a mushroom cloud was non-existent. The link to al-Qaeda, fiction. And while Saddam Hussein was removed, the Iraqi people hardly greeted U.S. troops as liberators. The Bush administration promised a quick, clean war that would more than pay for itself, militarily, politically, and economically. But the situation quickly spiraled out of control. 4,400 dead U.S. soldiers, 100,000 to perhaps 1.5 million dead Iraqis, $800 billion spent. If that wasn't enough to get Washington's attention, the poll numbers were. A significant majority of Americans came to believe that the war was not morally justified and that it was, quote, a dumb thing to do.
After nearly 9 years, America's war in Iraq will be over.
By any metric, the war in Iraq was a catastrophe. For Iraq, the invasion and occupation were devastating. Hundreds of thousands of lives lost, the country's infrastructure smashed, its social fabric in tatters. A grinding civil war is still killing hundreds of Iraqis every month. Baghdad, a cosmopolitan capital for thousands of years, now a cluster of walled ghettos, armed against each other. For the US, Iraq became a quagmire, a humiliation, a strategic disaster, and a moral failure. The world, certainly the Muslim world, won't forget the nightmarish scenes of Abu Ghraib or the carnage of Fallujah anytime soon.
After a decade of war, we're turning the page and moving forward with strength and with confidence. The drawdown in Iraq allowed us to refocus on Afghanistan and achieve major victories against al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden.
President Obama entered the White House promising a new relationship with the Arab and Muslim world. His administration is withdrawing troops, replacing them with airstrikes, drones, and a surge of special forces. So how much has America's calculus of war really changed? Does Obama's new math add up?
Chris, Barbara, John Marie, welcome to Empire. Let's start with the big picture. In retrospect, was the Iraq war on an occupation a mistake, a quagmire, a war crime?
It was all of those things, along with perhaps the greatest strategic blunder in American foreign policy, because it destroyed Iraq as a unified nation, and it's never coming back. The experiment that was Iraq after the Ottoman Empire is gone. It radically reconfigured the power balance within the Middle East, of course, tipping power into the hands of Tehran. And the expansion of the war, in essence, the occupation throughout the Middle East, has created ultimately an untenable situation. At its most basic level, the Arab world and the Muslim world is asking not to be occupied, and they will fight until those occupation forces are gone.
The whole idea of remaking the Middle East, starting with Iraq, that idea, that bombastic idea, do you think still lingers in anyone's mind?
I think probably not, hopefully not. But I think a war of choice is always an enormous gamble on the life of others. And that gamble was lost, I think, for the reasons that have been stated. It's not enough to remove a dictator to have a nice society that is waiting in the wings to take over. You remove a dictator and you see how polluted the society has been by years of dictatorship. You remove a dictator in Iraq and you realize that a Middle East peace that is based on a balance between Iran and the Arab countries is a very precarious way of achieving peace in the Middle East. And that's what we are now seeing in many places, including in Syria.
Well, we didn't just remove a leader either. I mean, there was this, one policy early on was decapitation. And I don't think that that was a very wise or well thought through policy either. But we then exacerbated the many mistakes going in. First of all, do we go in at all? That's a big question. Did we go in militarily the right way? That's another question. But the whole question of the day after. And we not only removed Saddam ultimately, but we, in a sense, took the skeleton out of the Iraqi body politic, not only with the demobilization of the military, But when we put forward our version of de-Baathification, we took all the technocrats, all the professionals, all the educated people out of the government. And as I said, it was like removing not just the head, but the entire skeletal structure. And it collapsed.
Before we get to the actual operational aspect of it, is it a question that it wasn't planned right? Or is it a question, no matter how it's planned, it shouldn't have been fought?
It certainly shouldn't have been fought. So the intelligence failures that led us to believe that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, it was a situation we hadn't seen before. And it turns out that he was trying to convince Iran that he had nuclear weapons and was unwilling to lift that veil and show us that he was lying, that he was bluffing. And so we went to war for improper reasons. We did not need to fight this war. And leaving all that aside, we fought the war very badly. We put just enough troops in to collapse the regime, but absolutely abdicated our responsibility to build a better peace in the aftermath of the war.
You know, it was a non-reality based belief system. All of the arguments for going into war, that the oil revenues would pay for reconstruction, that we would be greeted as liberators, that democracy would be implanted in Baghdad and emanate outwards across the Middle East. These were the raison d'etre for going into Baghdad, yet any Arabist in the State Department, in the intelligence community, in the Pentagon, and I know because I talked to them, knew that this was insane. And unfortunately, Cheney and that cabal, Pearl and others, embraced this non-reality-based belief and prosecuted a war based on it.
But I was part of that early group.
For Reconstruction.
For Reconstruction. And we went into Iraq for the day after without a plan.
That's right.
We had no plan. We had a country of 25 million people, traumatized by decades of Ba'ath rule, traumatized again by a decade of sanctions, traumatized a third time by our military operation. And we had 120 civilians to run a country of 25 million people. That's lunacy. And we had no real plan. The plan was, it's actually the game plan such as it was that we were going to go in April, and we were going to help create a government, get the ministries up and running, have a constitution written, constitutional convention, have parliamentary elections, presidential elections, and turn it all over to the Iraqis by August. Of course, it did turn out to be August, just turned out to be August 10 years later.
And back to America. 10 years later, do you feel that that lesson, that irresponsibility, that way of going to war on false pretense, you think that has been really internalized here in Washington?
I think that there is a great desire not to repeat those mistakes. And I think this is part of what is leading President Obama to choose drone strikes, to choose leading from behind, not to intervene overtly in the Syrian massacres that continue that tragedy. There is a huge desire not to go there again.
But in the political culture in the capital, those who over the last few years called for perhaps an attack in Iran or an invasion of Iran and so on and so forth, how come that these voices remain heard in the country?
I don't think those voices are being heard. I think that the United States made a generational mistake, and my hope is that it won't make that mistake for another generation, if then. But the tragedies of this war that continue to compound will exert a dead hand on American foreign policy, I think, for a generation.
I slightly disagree. The voices that led us into Iraq, they're still there. They may be in the minority, they may be out of power, but they're absolutely still there, and they are utterly unrepentant. They will not admit that the decisions were poorly made, bad decisions were poorly made and poorly executed.
Well, certainly they won't pull the idea of attacking Iran off the table.
Well, it's the same group. If you see the people who are pushing...
No, but President Obama won't put that choice off the table.
He won't take it off the table. That's different from somebody who is leading with that. The group that got us into Iraq led with military action, with diplomatic sanctions and everything being, not really taken seriously. no president's going to take a military option formally off the table. But everything that the president has done has shown, I think, that he does not wish to put boots on the ground.
And let me, I mean, John and Barbara can answer this better, but my sense is that within the established institutions, the intelligence community and the Pentagon, they do not want to go into Iraq.
Or the State Department.
Or the State Department. I think that has to be clear.
Yeah.
So it's a rogue element outside of the establishment that is pushing for this.
The debate has really shifted, I think.
Yeah.
You have those who think, okay, let's use military force, but with very limited aims. And those who think, well, just nation building, state building, that's just too complicated. Let's not touch it. And I think there is a danger of overreacting to the failures of Iraq, thinking, oh, all those countries, we don't know them, we shouldn't touch them. Let's just have some targeted strikes and that will do the job, which is an excess in the other direction, in my view.
As a French diplomat, do you think any such war now should be fought unilaterally? Should a country like the United States be taking the multilateral and take that sanction from the UN Security Council before going into any war, regardless whether it's Iran or as well?
I think an essential part of any success in that kind of operation is its perceived legitimacy. That you compound the difficulties if you're seen just pushing your own national interest. So I do think that a multilateral framework, some UN blessing is essential, not just formally, but for the real success of the operation.
John, the question of the strategic result out of that war, 10 years later, Maliki is prime minister. Some people consider him as a little Saddam of sort.
Prime minister for life, yes.
The situation is problematic sectarian-wise and so on. The country sometimes might fall apart. How do you think strategically it all worked out for the United States in Iraq?
Horribly. But not as horribly as I expected it to in 2006, when Iraq was in the throes of full-scale civil war, and there was every chance that the entire Middle East was going to split in two. So for all of the disasters that Iraq was, for the strategic errors, the intelligence failures, the absolute lack of planning prior to the war, Churchill said, you can always count on the United States to do the right thing after it has exhausted every possible alternative. And in some ways, the American military reached that point toward the middle of the Iraq War, and I think bailed the boat out and achieved only disaster from what could have been a tragedy.
Do you think Washington has leverage over the prime minister in Iraq?
Very little. Very little. And that's one of the reasons why Iran is using Iraqi airspace to transfer weapons to the Syrian regime.
I think the missing part in the whole policy is the regional policy. You're not going to have a stable Iraq if you don't have a stable region. And because of the nuclear issue with Iran and the so far impossibility of resolving that issue, we are sort of caught in the battle, the ongoing battle between the Gulf countries, Sunni monarchies, and Iran. And that's going to keep infecting the whole region until it's solved.
The idea that Iraq could break up into sectarian violence, or it has, of course, in the past, and the idea that this could have an overspill or spill over to the rest of the region, that's a major cause of instability throughout. I don't think then anyone will be able to contain that afterwards.
Yeah, well, it's a whole deal that was arranged after the end of World War I that is runs a risk of really falling apart. The Sykes-Picot and the deal between the French and the British at the time. You see it with the Kurds. I mean, the Kurds, they are in Iran, they are in Turkey.
So it will be a double curse.
Yes, it could happen that way. If we don't manage to find a solution where those countries live on the basis of cooperation rather than balance of power.
One of the causes for the sectarian violence in Iraq, John, was the whole counter-insurgency, some people claim. That the idea that you needed to support a number of Sunni tribes, you need to support a number of Shiite militias, and in the end of the day, that sort of support against Al-Qaeda elements or against the resistance to the occupation created more and more sectarian violence after 2005. Do you still hold dear the counter-insurgency tactics that you've done in Iraq?
Oh dear. I think that counterinsurgency is an enormously difficult, costly, slow process. I don't recommend it except when it is the last alternative available. And I believe that was the case in Iraq when we finally started practicing counterinsurgency. But what ultimately happened in Iraq was the Sunnis who resisted first the American occupation and then what they saw as a Shia occupation, ultimately decided to stop fighting with al-Qaeda in Iraq and turned against them and started fighting against them and became incorporated to some degree into the governing power structure of Iraq. And I've actually been surprised how well that arrangement has held. I think because the Sunnis recognize that they have no alternative.
They tried to copy it, regardless of how well it worked. They tried to copy it in Afghanistan, and that did not work out.
I would push back again and say that it worked where it was tried again and resourced, but slowly and with enormous difficulty. And in Afghanistan, a place that is even more difficult to find a counterinsurgency campaign than Iraq is. Iraq, an urban war, Afghanistan, a rural one. Iraq, enormous human capital, and Afghanistan, almost none after 30 continuous years of war.
And I think watching what happened in Afghanistan is, and you maybe, John, can address this, but I think that people went into Afghanistan thinking it was Iraq and trying to impose a counterinsurgency campaign that they felt was successful in Iraq, and that's why it misfired in Afghanistan.
We really lost the war in Afghanistan, I think, in 2002, 2003.
Yes.
That early?
Because, yes, because then we wanted to win the war on the cheap.
Yes.
And so made alliances with people who really built the base for the Taliban. And so we shouldn't be surprised. And then when that policy was evolved, it was too late. And I think there's one question there with counterinsurgency. It sort of assumes that there's a government that would be supported by the people if there were not those bad insurgents who prevent the people from loving their government.
And what would they expect from the insurgents
and there wasn't in either place.
There was not. That was not the case.
John, before we go to the news break, just one last thought on Iraq. How much do you think the American military developed its counterterrorism tactics, the one that you use later on in Iraq?
I think Stan McChrystal and what he did with the Joint Special Operations Command in Iraq was an important part of changing the course of that war, and those tactics have continued, the capabilities have continued to be used, not just in Afghanistan, the counterterrorism tactics around the globe.
Does that include the torture? Does that include?
No, it does not. These are the ability to gather intelligence, collate intelligence from a number of different sources and act on it rapidly in order to remove terrorists from the battlefield.
Assassinations?
By killing if necessary, but by capturing if you can.
But the tactics that came to be part of the doctrine of counterterrorism more or less were developed also in Iraq.
Certainly Iraq had a huge influence on what happened, and the Joint Special Operations Command and its capabilities were developed in Iraq by Stan McChrystal and his team.
And then he went to Afghanistan. So
hold that thought.
So the
We're going to
DNA
come
is
back
there.
to talk
The
about
DNA is there.
what happened beyond Iraq. After the Bush plan failed to remake the Middle East, the Obama plan focused on al-Qaeda and killed bin Laden. So why is Washington fighting on more fronts throughout the region than ever before?
We've gone after them in the Fatah in Pakistan. We've gone after them in Afghanistan. We're going after them in Yemen. We're going after them in Somalia.
Different al-Qaeda affiliates and extremist groups have emerged from the Arabian Peninsula to Africa. The threat these groups pose is evolving.
Welcome back with my guests, John Nagel, Jean-Marie Guénon, Barbara Bodine, and Christopher Hedges. The war on terror is contagious, and as it metamorphoses from Afghanistan to Mali, so are its blunders and inconsistencies. We will stay, quote, for as long as it's necessary to ensure victory over terrorism, unquote. If that sounds like a line straight out of the mouth of George Bush or Donald Rumsfeld, think again. It's French President François Hollande, the same socialist president who recently told his people that there would be, quote, no men on the ground, no engagement by French troops, unquote, and that France would only provide, quote, material support to Mali's armed forces. The twists and turns of the West's war on terror are continuing to confound and to confuse.
Tonight we are a country awakened to danger and called to defend freedom. Whether we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done.
Our spirit is stronger and cannot be broken. You cannot outlast us, and we will defeat you.
The United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda. Justice has been done.
But what kind of justice takes the lives of 20,000 Afghan civilians? Just like a bad movie franchise, retribution knows no end.
They are a threat that is localized, becoming regionalized, and left unaddressed will become a global threat.
This is a global threat, and it will require a global response.
We've gone after them in the Fatah in Pakistan. We've gone after them in Afghanistan. Obviously, there are other elements of Al-Qaeda that are out there.
And that includes Iraq, where obviously there was hardly any Al-Qaeda prior to the invasion, and it hasn't stopped there.
We're going after them in Yemen. We're going after them in Somalia.
And from Somalia to Mali.
We will work with the Malians themselves to prevent a new terrorist haven developing on Europe's doorstep.
Global threat, terrorist haven, we've seen this movie before. Instead of Blair and Bush, we have Cameron and Obama, shoulder to shoulder. And this time, with a new unlikely ally.
You ask what we will do to terrorists if we find them. Destroy them.
Although France had played only a minor supporting role in the aerial sequel of the War on Terror, the French President François Hollande wasted little time in taking a lead role in the latest adventure, in sending troops and fighter jets to help the Malian army recapture the north of the country from Islamist rebels. France is once again playing imperial gendarme, a role it has refused since the heyday of France-Afrique.
If this choice hadn't been made, Mali would have been entirely conquered today, and terrorists would be in a dominating position.
And if Malians were seeking a clear plan of action or an exit strategy from the intervening power, first they hear this.
France restera avec vous. France will be on your side as long as needed.
And then they hear this.
France has no intention of staying in Mali.
Sound familiar? A quick military engagement followed by a smooth handover to the central government was also part of the plan for Afghanistan and Iraq. But in the grand narrative of the so-called War on Terror, nuance always loses the stereotype. Terrorists means Islamists, and Islamists means Al-Qaeda and those linked to it. The danger with such broad strokes is that Islam itself is tarred with the same brush, a danger not lost on American presidents.
Ours is a war against terrorism and evil, not against Islam.
America is at war with Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, and we will never be at war with Islam or any other religion.
The latest sequel in the War on Terror stars a new face of an old enemy.
We in Al-Qaeda announced this blessed operation. We are ready to negotiate with the West and the Algerian government, provided they stop their bombing of Mali's Muslims.
The latest in a long series of targets, from the most wanted man in history, Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan and Pakistan, to Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi in Iraq, Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen, and now to the uncatchable Mukhtar bil-Mukhtar, the self-proclaimed mastermind of the attack on the Western-owned gas plant in Algeria. The interest of foreigners in Africa may be a subplot to the latest sequel of the War on Terror. New global powers from east to west vie for the riches of Africa, whilst old imperial ones reinforce bonds to their former colonial backyard. But will the French assurances of a quick withdrawal be fulfilled, or will we see a rehash of the American script in Iraq and Afghanistan? Barbara, as the song goes, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. How different exactly is Obama in his counterterrorism tactics from President Bush?
I think in many ways it's fundamentally different. If you look at the core reason for Afghanistan and Iraq, it was 9/11, it was counterterrorism as the way that they rationalized it. What I think, and it was very unilateral, so it was heavy military, very conventional military, regime change, nation building, all of that. What the current administration has said is same basic enemy. But first of all, it's far more diffuse. We don't have al-Qaeda central the way we had before. And instead of sending major amounts of troops into Yemen, we are going to target the bad guys, not the country within which they are operating.
And certainly the
and
Obama
we're also doing leading from behind as opposed to unilateral.
And the counter-terror, they're not leading anything from behind. They're actually going out there and doing it themselves.
In the broader sense,
and if anything, the Obama administration has turned it up to 11. But if you look at the drone strikes,
yeah.
There's a spike just before the transition of power from Bush to Obama because the military,
right.
the agency, thought that President Obama was going to stop the drone strikes, and instead he accelerated them. We've seen those numbers go down just recently, frankly, largely because there aren't many targets left because that campaign has been so effective.
I think more or less Obama has, as we just stated, he's gone on far more drone attacks, far more expansion.
But that's because al-Qaeda has metastasized to all of these other places, and so we have affiliates of.
So actually, there's a major failure of the war on terror.
No, because these affiliates.
You're saying they're metastasized.
They have, but it's like hitting a drop of mercury. But the little tiny droplets in Yemen, in Mali, honestly don't have much capability to hurt the United States. They're really, I think, a regional threat.
Christopher, I want to read you something from Michael Hayden, the former National Security Advisor for Bush and Director of the CIA. He said just a few months ago, he said, when it comes to the war on terror, from rendition to targeted killings, to state secrets, to Guantanamo Bay, to domestic spying, Barack did exactly what W. Bush did.
He's expanded. In fact, he's done more than Bush has done. And I think the expansion of these attacks is a disaster. I mean, I covered al-Qaeda for the New York Times. What is al-Qaeda? Well, you know, in places like Yemen, it's Samir and Ahmed and Mohammed who get a pistol. You know, I mean, the idea that al-Qaeda is any kind of a top-down organization. I mean, you know, there are all sorts of these people wandering around these countries identifying themselves as al-Qaeda who the purported leaders of al-Qaeda have never heard of. And that gets to the fundamental problem, which is the overwhelming use of force, the terror of drones. You know, I've been around American firepower. There's nothing surgical about it when you start talking about Hellfire missiles. When you go into places like, especially Afghanistan, you're really blind. Intelligence is run mostly out of informants. I saw it in Latin America. These informants have other agendas, tribal disputes, all sorts of disputes. It ends up creating far more antagonistic elements and entities than stopping them.
I think you need to make a distinction between those terrorists who really are not territorial, like bin Laden, who have a global agenda, and then the local conflicts on which they piggyback, so to speak. And the danger of those strikes is that you conflate the two.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And then you mobilize, mobilize people who have no global agenda,
That's right.
whether they're in Yemen, or Somalia, or Mali, or Afghanistan. But suddenly they become part of a much bigger story.
But actually, I remember reading in one of those counterinsurgency manuals is that al-Qaeda is seen as the so-called SPIN, segmented, polycentric, ideologically networked group, which means you can look at any group in Yemen, Somalia, Algeria, Mali, and so on and so forth. This is part of an Islamic fundamentalist, polycentric, ideologically networked groups. They're all Muslims. We don't understand them. They're all over the place, and they're all shouting anti-American slogans, even if their question is very local. And hence that confuses the entire issue for the United States. Who are you going to bomb? Who are you going to kill? Who are you going to assassinate?
I think that the drone strikes have continued, and frankly, the targets are no longer strategic. We're moving down to some operational and tactical targets. And I think we may have gone too far. I don't disagree with Chris on that point. But it's important to note that without invading Pakistan, which was either intentionally or unintentionally providing a home base to al-Qaeda, we have managed to all but defeat that organization as an existential threat.
One of the best analysis I've read about the situation in Mali is that in the end of the day, the French had to intervene because the Americans failed after 40 years of counter-terrorist operations
Well, Mali was not a war of choice. I mean, there was a risk that Bamako, that the whole country would fall under the control of the groups in the north.
But do you agree that the Americans failed?
I think there
4 years of counterterrorism.
I think there was what was missing in that effort was a political, and it's our collective failure, to be honest. Was a political effort to put together this country, which is Mali. And it's not just a problem between North Mali and South Mali, it's a problem within the North, it's a problem within the South. And that opened opportunities for the kind of non-territorial groups that we were discussing.
But doesn't that sound to you like Yemen, like Afghanistan, problems of the North, problems in the South? It's pretty messy. We don't understand. Some people want to split. It sounds like Iraq, like Afghanistan, like Lebanon, like Syria, like Yemen,
I would say,
like Somalia.
Okay, I do think that one common failing, inadequacy over the last 10 years in the broader CT approach has been that we have continued to rely on security, military, AFRICOM, training troops, training guys how to shoot bad guys. But what we have not done, and this is part of COIN, it's also just part of common sense, is that across the board, we have failed to put as much time, attention, thought into governance issues, into economic development issues.
I agree, but I would go one step further because we have a much too technical view of what is development and what is state building.
Yes.
We think we bring a few technicians to consolidate this ministry or that ministry, while at the heart it's a political process. It's whether the people from different affiliations, different part of the country can agree on a certain way of running their country, the power, how they will share power. And that we ignore. We have a very technocratic view.
Yes.
And because of that, then you have states who are failing, and that provides opportunities for those non-territorial groups which do not really care about Mali or Yemen or whatever, but they see an opening and they use it. And then they make local alliances, and then our job is to sever those alliances.
But you are assuming that they do want to do economy building, nation building, state building in these countries. Do they?
I'm trying to think when in the American empire we have walked in and actually created an open society. I mean, you know, I've seen whether it's the elections in Gaza, you know, D'Aubuisson won the elections in Salvador and then we just annul them. I mean, it's an endless kind of list. We want a compliant government that does our bidding. We don't really want democracy.
The same thing goes with extracting resources. I haven't seen Europeans doing anything in Africa except extract resources. When have you seen Europeans doing anything in terms of society or economy building in Africa?
What did we do in Iraq? We made sure all the oil contracts went to, I mean, you know, in an era of diminishing natural resources, this battle for resources becomes more acute. And the Chinese and us are playing one off the other.
But I think we shouldn't beat ourselves too much on the chest on that one because...
I think you should.
No, I don't. I disagree. And I will tell you why. I mean, the natural resources, you see the European Union helping countries negotiate better contracts. That is something important.
But Jean-Marie, to get a lot in return. I mean, you know, they don't have friends in Africa. They have interests in Africa. And the European Union knows that Africa is its backyard. And it has all these resources.
Let me defend the French
and it's a market.
France intervened in Mali, not for economic reasons, but because of human rights disasters. And I think that was a fairly noble act. That was not.
You're saying that as a military man.
I'm saying something nice about the French. That is exactly right.
You actually think that the French don't want to be hegemon in Africa and don't want to maintain that status?
You don't
think they're playing the superpower card?
No. They see Africa as a continent that has enormous potential, that has grown at 5% in the past few years. France does not have any interest in running whole sway. I mean, a big part of Africa. It doesn't. France wants a prosperous Africa, and they're working on it. Stable Africa. That's a national interest, but that's not an interest that is in contradiction with African interests.
I'm going to leave this point aside, so we move closer to the recapping 10 years and looking at the whole war on terror. If you're not looking at it from a European perspective, if you're looking at it from an Arab or Muslim perspective, what do you see 10 years there, 12 years there in Afghanistan? What you see is, in the end of the day, Westerners with heavy power, with bombastic moral claims, fighting wars in Muslim lands.
Right.
That doesn't really look very good, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I think that that's actually not a bad summation of what has happened over the last 10 years. We have gone in with bombastic ideology, self-interest, and no real plan. I mean, if you're going to do this, at least do it competently. We have done all of that very incompetently.
I've been disappointed by the amount of economic developments and governance assistance that the United States and our allies have provided around the globe. I think we've gotten that part wrong. And so the problem we have, as Jean-Marie said, is we have a world with unstable places that attract radical ideologies in order to change those societies, to prevent those organizations from developing long-term deep roots in those societies. We have to put boots on the ground. I've been in those boots. Those are uncomfortable boots. The alternative is to do the economic development and the good governance, but those are long, hard, it takes a very long time for those efforts to come to fruition.
Look, this is, the entire doctrine of using military force to subdue radical Islam within the Middle East is woefully misguided and counterproductive.
Would you say this is the fundamental error in the war on terror?
And that this war is not going to end until we leave. We use the word good guys. Well, if I was an Iraqi, who's a good guy? Maliki. If I'm an Afghani, is Karzai a good guy? I don't want my country to be occupied.
Or with a puppet regime, or so on and so forth.
Of course. I mean, these are classic colonial puppets, mostly in power to enrich themselves and their small cabal of predators. And I see the entire move to expand these proxy wars, to use drone strikes, and let's be clear, I mean, when you have drones circling over your village 24 hours a day, I mean, these are instruments of terror.
Nightmare.
It's a nightmare. And we are the best, and we have been since we went into Afghanistan, the best recruiting weapon these forces have. We have expanded them, throughout the region.
19,000 drones now being used by the
Pentagon.
It's insane.
And so I see, it's not a tactic that can somehow be modified to become successsul. The problem is the tactic itself.
So, Jean-Marie, it's not boots on the ground.
Well, I think the danger
solution
is
from the air,
from one extreme to the other. Frankly, the lesson of those 10 years: military force, it's a last resort. To exclude military force, going way too far. I mean, military force will have to be used in some cases.
As in Mali, you mean?
As in Mali, I think when a country is going to fall under the control of a terrorist movement, it's a good thing to use force. But at the same time, the idea that that force is going to be the full answer is crazy.
That's the problem.
The idea about Mali falling under the control of a terrorist movement, that's also a stretch, no?
Well, it didn't look like a stretch.
I mean, that looks good for a scenario for intervention.
It looked very much what was going to happen if it hadn't been.
There are different groups fighting in Mali.
Yeah, and that's the political challenge now, to separate them so that those who really have a global terrorist agenda are isolated, and then you rebuild Mali, and for that you need legitimacy.
But they never do rebuild. And the exclusive use of military force, because you talk but you talk about it as if there's a possibility within the configurations of power to actually build civil societies, and they don't do it. They have never done it.
But not doing it is not. I think we're all in furious agreement with each other. That what we ought to be doing, we agree on.
But I disagree, if I may, Barbara. I disagree with all the four of you, I guess, then.
Okay.
Maybe we'll talk about goodwill. But, we look at history. History shows us that 100 and some years ago, American soldiers, 4,000 of them died in the Philippines, killing several hundred thousand civilians. Only a few years ago, that's why we're meeting today, 4,400 died in Iraq, several hundred thousand Iraqis died. We're not learning any lessons of any history, it seems. No, and if I may, in the Muslim world, you, the French, out of all people, you know what sort of history you had, from Algeria onto the next country. There is a problem there. You intervene in Mali because it is part of your, backyard. It is part of your ex-colonial
Well,
expeditions,
we intervened
right?
because we were asked to intervene, and there were not many takers to do it.
No, what I mean is you wouldn't intervene in other places. You weren't exactly that keen on Iraq. You were not very keen on Afghanistan, but you were more than happy to intervene in Mali. It is part of your backyard.
It's not as a backyard. It's part. We were asked by the Malian government to give a hand at a time when the whole country was at the risk of failing. And I think the challenge, and that's where some lessons may have been learned from the last 10 years, is that indeed we have baggage. Indeed there are memories. And that means we must
hand over
as quickly as possible to legitimate organization. That's very different from what happened in Iraq. There's no appetite to run a big military show in Mali. There's every desire to have the United Nations, to have an impartial broker take over and help facilitate with African forces, take over and help facilitate what will be now the core challenge, which is a political process between Malians so that they can agree on the future shape of their country.
We'll meet next year and we'll discuss that. For the time being, Barbara, Chris, Jean-Marie, thank you for joining Empire. And I will be back with a final thought. The French are a decisive, manly superpower, unlike America. Or so read a U.S. headline this week. America less manly than the surrendering monkey of Iraq? This is what you call a low blow. War, we're told, has been good for the national morale. France has demonstrated in Mali that it remains a great power, playing a role once played by the United States, that of setting the tone for democracy and peace around the world. You've probably heard this verbal diarrhea before from the macho militarists and the chicken hawks who talked America into the Iraqi quagmire. Alas, virility knows no limit. It transcends culture, and it increasingly transcends gender as more women embrace a manly man's world of violence. And yet, after all the death and destruction, one thinks, or hopes, many more men and women come to see such manliness for the utter madness it is. And that's the way it goes. Don't forget, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and write to us with your comments and suggestions. Until next time.